Welcome, everyone. This is the 33rd Annual California Small Farm Conference, and this is the Climate and Agricultural Policy Workshop, in case you're confused about which workshop you're in. I want to thank all of you for attending, and I want to thank our speakers and the sponsors that made this possible. You can learn more about the sponsors in the virtual expo hall, which will be linked in the chat. This conference is, of course, free to everyone this year. I've been to many small farm conferences. Out of the 33, this is the first one I've ever done on a computer, and hopefully the last. But we would very much appreciate a small donation, and you'll find that link in the chat box as well, if you are so moved. This workshop is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel in perpetuity, I imagine. And this is an interactive session. So you are all muted, and please stay muted unless you're called on. If you have a question, put it in the chat. And if it's not answered by one of the panelists in the chat, then we'll try to raise it when we get to question and answer session later on in the hour. Please keep your comments and questions respectful and constructive. And let's get started here. I'm Dave Runsten. I'm the CAFF Policy Director, which I've been for the last 15 years. And we have two panelists with us today. Eric Deeble, who's the Director of Policy at the National Sustainable Agricultural Coalition in Washington, D.C. He was the Senior Policy Advisor in the office of Senator Kirsten Gillibrand from New York, and worked on a wide array of U.S. food and farm policy for almost 7 years. He's also a large animal veterinarian. So I suppose if you have some vet questions, he'd be a good person to answer them. And before that, he worked in the not-for-profit sector on safe housing conditions for elderly and disabled people. We also have Jeanne Merrill with us, who's the Policy Director of the California Climate and Agriculture Network, or CalCAN as it's commonly known, which she's been at for 12 years, I think now. Is that right, Jeanne? 12 years ago. And so in full disclosure, I helped Renata Brillinger start CalCAN, and then Renata insisted that we hire Jeanne immediately if we were going to get anything done. And so we did that, and that has turned out to be a very successful hire, I must say. So I'm on the executive committee of CalCAN, and so I've watched everything that's gone on over the years. And so I'm sure that I'll have some comments here as we go along. So why don't we start with Jeanne and California, and we'll get to the nation state here in a few minutes. So Jeanne, what can you tell us about CalCAN and your work? California is an early innovator in climate change and agriculture programs. What are they? What is their status, and what do you consider CalCAN's greatest achievements over the past 12 years?
Great. Well, Dave, thank you, and thank you for that kind introduction. So let me just give a little bit of background on CalCAN. We are the California Climate and Agriculture Network. We are a coalition of organic and sustainable agriculture organizations. And as Dave described, we were started in 2009. At the time, California had passed the country's most ambitious climate change legislation in the country just a few years prior, and was getting underway with implementing that law, AB 32. And at the time, there really wasn't much of a conversation about climate change and agriculture issues vis-a-vis implementation of AB 32. And there wasn't much of a voice for sustainable agriculture on these issues, and we wanted to change that. So we started very early on in the creation of CalCAN to introduce legislation to create state climate change and agriculture programs with a focus on delivering and developing resources for farmers to be able to address the changing climate, to become more resilient, to be able to be part of the solution to the climate crisis, to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions, increase carbon sequestration, but in ways that were meaningful and contributed to the viability of farmers staying on the land in California. So that was the impetus for CalCAN. And our first several bills to create a climate change and agriculture program using funds from the cap and trade program through the auctions were largely unsuccessful. And it was only until 2014 when the state began to figure out how to invest those dollars to advance maybe 32 and look to invest in climate activities that the beginning of the climate smart agriculture programs began. In 2014, California, of course, was still heavily in drought. And so the first two programs, one was the State Water Efficiency and Enhancement Program, which was all about providing dollars to farmers to support their efforts to reduce water use, save energy, and save related reduce related greenhouse gas emissions, program called SWEEP. And then the Sustainable Ag Lands Conservation Program, which was part of a larger effort on behalf of the state to look at how does California support smart growth development to reduce vehicle miles traveled, to have people work and live closer to their homes. And I'm about to be interrupted here. Iona, no, it's not. It's Saturday. What am I doing on a Zoom call?
Yeah, unfair, Mom.
Yes, that's right. So that was the beginning of CalCAN. But Dave, tell me what else I should answer as I address my daughter here for a moment.
So we created these environmental farming programs at CDFA. What else did we accomplish over this 12 years? I remember some things related to net energy metering and some other initiatives. CAFF actually supported AB 32 back in 2006 under Schwarzenegger. And our motivation for starting CalCAN was really that we weren't able to get anywhere. The Farm Bureau was appointed in charge of climate change and agriculture, and they had opposed it. And so that's kind of a question I have now going forward. But we'll get to that in a minute. So what the cap and trade program has really supplied the money we've used for these environmental farming programs for quite a few years now. They've come under attack from the environmental justice groups who say that cap and trade doesn't really reduce pollution in their neighborhoods. It allows the polluters essentially to escape that. What do you think about that? I see Mary Nichols was not appointed head of EPA in part because of that. And a recent audit showed that the ARB was not doing a good job of actually measuring the results of these activities under cap and trade. Do you think cap and trade is going to survive in California?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, back in 2017, when Jerry Brown was still governor, there was a discussion in the legislature and with the governor about the future of the cap and trade program. The state had extended its climate change goals to the year 2030, but the cap and trade program was not extended to the year 2030. And at the beginning of that conversation, we thought it very likely that California might consider switching from a cap and trade system to a carbon tax system. And ultimately, the carbon tax discussion dissipated pretty quickly. And it then became a conversation about extending the cap and trade program to the year 2030. And that law was passed. I don't know. I mean, under the Governor Newsom's administration, they've committed to reviewing the cap and trade program and what reforms may need to happen. My sense is that it's probably more likely that they look to strengthen the cap and trade program as opposed to look to change it entirely. But I think the critiques from environmental justice groups and other impacted communities are certainly valid and important, and need to be considered, because California is at great risk of not meeting its climate goals while also continuing to pollute in impacted communities. There was a report that came out not too long ago that said if California continues on its current trajectory, we won't meet our 2030 climate change goals into the year 2060. And that's simply unacceptable. So something needs to change clearly if we're going to both meet our climate goals and reduce pollutants in impacted communities.
Great, thanks. So as people join, remember that you're muted and stay muted until you are called on, perhaps later on. If you have a question, please put it in the chat, and we'll pay attention to the questions in the chat. So let's go over to Eric and talk a little bit about the national, what's going on in Washington, D.C. Tell us a little bit about the National Sustainable Ag Coalition and what the work the coalition has been doing recently on climate change. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Dave. Happy to do that. And I have to say right at the top, there's nothing I enjoy more in agriculture than listening to Dave and Jeanne talk to each other about climate change, because every time they do, I learn something. So as Dave said at the top, I'm Eric Deeble. I'm the policy director at the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. NSAC, as it's most commonly known, is a 30-year-old coalition of more than 130 grassroots farmer-serving organizations that advocates for federal policy. So I'm going to try to talk about the Washington, D.C. inside the 395 Beltway perspective today. And the federal policy that we work on is to reform and advance sustainability in agriculture, food systems, natural resources, and rural communities. And the coalition works across the entire spectrum of the food system, all the way from the very upstream supply input side all the way to distribution and potentially using benefits to purchase foods from farmers markets for a family in need. The coalition is really interested in making sure that there's safe, ample, affordable, healthy food available to everyone in their own community, and that food is produced by farmers who earn a decent living and get to live in healthy and vital rural communities. I guess at its most basic, NSAC brings the grassroots voices of small and mid-sized farmers into the halls of Congress. NSAC's a true coalition, and I think both Dave and Jeanne can attest to that. So the priorities and policies are generated with the membership in consultation with the policy staff in DC, and it is a very participatory, some would say Byzantine process, but it is a very effective one because it makes sure that the policies that NSAC puts forward when we do go into those offices really do work for farmers and support them well. Lots of programs that folks on the call probably know about, things like CSP and SARE. NSAC was there at the beginning of those programs and helped to bring them into being. And we work with legislators and policymakers and agency staff to help create new programs, make existing ones better. NSAC never misses the opportunity to make comments on bills, rulings, regulations, you name it, we always comment. And we also help to bring farmers into DC so that they can speak directly with legislators so that those legislators can understand what they really need. So that's NSAC in a nutshell.
Great. All right. So we have a new administration. We weren't getting anywhere in the last administration on climate change. And now we have a new administration that claims that they're really going to do something about it. They rejoined the Paris Accords and so on and so forth. What do you think about that, Eric? Do you think that there's really an opportunity, or is the 50-50 split in the Senate going to block efforts of that sort?
It is the greatest opportunity to have a real impact on climate change in my lifetime. It is going to be an extraordinary challenge to make those efforts match the need. And Dave, you said it right there that, there's a 50-50 split in the Senate, which makes things quite a challenge. It makes it very difficult to get a large climate package or any major bill through the Senate in particular, because, the filibuster is still a thing and it still requires 60 votes to overcome a filibuster. And so long as the filibuster remains in place, there are very few other tools that you could use to advance a very significant piece of legislation. But that's just the legislative side of things. There's also the opportunity for the administration to take unilateral actions through things like executive orders or through promulgation of new rules or changing existing programs to work more for climate adaptation and mitigation activities. And on that front, we see real opportunity. We've been engaged in dialogue with the administration since just after the election, giving them recommendations about how they could modify existing programs to work better for farmers that are looking to adapt to climate change and help to mitigate it. And the administration has been extremely receptive. They have taken our recommendations. They've asked for more. We've been involved, as have other members of our coalition, in an ongoing dialogue. And we can tell that they're earnest. Every time we get a new person in leadership, we get them on the phone, we have a conversation with them, and the first thing they say is, our boss said we have to fix climate change. I mean, it's as simple as that, and it's pervasive. And even if you're going off into a non-climate related section of USDA, that's the first thing that every single staffer tells us. So we know that they're serious about it.
Well, that's great. Jeanne, what do you think about that? You think that we have a real opportunity there in Washington, D.C. In this administration, this year? Yeah, this year probably.
Yes, I think absolutely. I would agree with Eric that that climate change is a fundamental priority for the Biden-Harris administration. They've made that quite clear. And we also know from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that we must globally begin to start to bend the curve on greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2030. So we simply cannot wait. And I think that message has really been driven home to this new administration, that action is needed this year to get the US back on track when it comes to climate change. And I'm also optimistic because I think for the first time, compared to where we were back in 2009, 2010, when there was discussion at the federal level around climate change in agriculture, it was climate change in ag back then was not really at the forefront. And I think that's quite different now. We're seeing a lot more discussion around climate change in agriculture issues at the federal level, from relevant legislation to discussions with USDA.
And have we seen any Republican support for this discussion?
I would say only around the margins. There are two different things that are going on. There are organizations that one would consider, farmer representing organizations that one would consider more conservative, that have been very reluctant to engage on climate change. We've seen that change over the last couple of years, and we've seen it rapidly accelerate in the last 3 to 6 months. And I'm talking about organizations that were climate change deniers for a long time, suddenly picking up a hymn book of, climate change is an existential threat to American agriculture, and farmers have to be part of the solution. And that's great. Because it's going to be a lot easier if everybody feels comfortable admitting that climate change is real, that it is affecting farmers now, and that farmers can be part of the solution. So that has lowered the threshold, or at least the level of alarm for a lot of farmers and a lot of farmer serving organizations. We haven't seen quite as much change in more conservative members of Congress. So it still is a challenge. There is a very modest, a bipartisan climate-centered ag bill. Senator Stabenow and Senator Braun's Growing Climate Solutions Act is a bipartisan piece of legislation. But we do not have in the Senate a significant bipartisan bill that really would turn the dial. The House side, a little different. We do have some bipartisanship there. We have the Agricultural Resilience Act, which is a very significant bill that would really increase the resources available to help USDA help farmers, again, with climate change mitigation and adaptation. And we expect to see that come over into the Senate. And we're very much hoping that that can be a bipartisan introduction when it does come over. So we're getting there, but as always, folks in the field are leading the folks in DC by a good margin.
So the Agricultural Resilience Act, can you put in the chat the bill number if you happen to know that off the top of your head?
I can do more than that. I'll actually put a link to Congresswoman Pingree's page that everybody can follow and can take a look at the primary provisions, which I'll do right now.
So, so this, you were talking about how some of the farm organizations are coming around. So we have this Food and Agriculture Climate Alliance, right, which the Farm Bureau, National Farmers Union, the Farmer Cooperatives, EDF, Nature Conservancy, you know, all started. And now suddenly a whole slew of mainstream agricultural organizations have joined in. You know, what are they trying to achieve, do you think? And are they going to, you know, move the Republican side of the thing in that kind of direction?
FACA is a very interesting and very new thing. It is a coalition of center and center-right organizations that are interested in having agriculture have a place in climate change and climate mitigation. If you look at the full spectrum of policies that FACA has put forward, the full series of policy recommendations, a lot of them make sense, but there are a couple in there that the folks in the NSAC coalition are really concerned about. And we think that some of the folks that are on the more, let's say, progressive side of agriculture have raised a lot of alarm bells. And most of that is around the appropriateness, the necessity, or the wisdom of creating carbon markets for carbon trading, for agricultural carbon credits. That's, I think, that's the 800-pound gorilla in the policy room. Whether or not it's necessary to create a financialized carbon credit system in order to drive resources to farmers to help them mitigate climate change. The folks at FACA certainly do want that to happen. And you know, it should be no surprise that public-private partnerships are much beloved by conservatives in Congress. And so this is a way that some of those folks can feel, well, again, it is their go-to when they're seeking to fund very large bills. And so I expect that to be central to the debate that we have, not just as we go towards the next reconciliation package, but as we get into the 2023 Farm Bill.
So Jeanne, here in California, we've always advocated for sort of a practice-based approach to this. The cap and trade funded programs at CDFA all focus on subsidizing the adoption of practices. Do you think that this is going to be possible at the federal level, or what have you seen around the country?
Yes, absolutely. I think it is. We modeled many of the California climate smart agriculture programs off of federal Farm Bill conservation programs and use USDA NRCS practice standards, for example, as part of the sort of foundation for the Healthy Soils program in particular here. So, well, you know, Eric certainly talked about the sort of rising interest, again, the return of, this is maybe it's a third or fifth return, I've lost track of carbon markets. They're back again as a proposal. It's been around for 15 years now, tried in various places unsuccessfully. Even in California, it's been unsuccessful. So yes, I think we'll continue to see carbon markets as part of the conversation, but we will also see as part of the conversation, how do we scale up and make relevant the Farm Bill conservation program so that they may begin to provide the resources necessary for farmers to address the climate crisis. And that is really the focus of the Agricultural Resilience Act that Eric mentioned earlier, which Congresswoman Shelley Pingree from Maine is the author of, and many a co-sponsor here in California as well. So yeah, I think we're at this pivotal point right now around where might we put our energy, our federal energy around supporting farmers and being able to address climate change. And I think that's a very dynamic and very fluid conversation at the moment.
So I saw there was a hearing actually in the House this week, and Gabe Brown showed up to basically say that regenerative agriculture would cure all your ills of every sort, might even tie your shoes. And so, you know, do we have any definition of regenerative agriculture that's operational? Will that be certified? I mean, how are we going to use that?
I don't know, you want to take that one, Eric?
Oh, no, absolutely not.
Okay,
This is the part where Dave starts asking really loaded questions. The definition of regenerative, well, there are many definitions of regenerative, and I think that's the challenge. Within the coalition, you know, we welcome farmers of all types and all shapes and sizes and varieties, and really we've learned a lot within the coalition from the work that Dave and Jeanne have done and the knowledge that they've gained over the sort of California carbon market space for the last 15 years. So rather than focus on market solutions or credits or cap and trades or trading systems, we too advocate for practices and performance-based outcomes from those practices. And so I don't even think that it is necessary to define regenerative, and I'll leave that to smarter people than I, but I can say that we know that there are practices that are effective. We've got tons of them within the CSP program. We've got many within the EQIP program. And we can make real investments into those programs and really increase outreach and to make sure that those programs are available to every farmer in every community. And that would be a really significant way of helping farmers adapt and mitigate without having to tie ourselves up in knots around a particular definition that, quite honestly, is probably going to change, you know, in a year or two.
Well, so let's talk about this carbon market thing then. You know, it's like we here in California, we've had people saying that, well, if we just spread some compost on rangeland, we would solve the climate problem. My people, the soil scientists who work for us, are constantly cautioning me, you know, not to say, oh yeah, we can sequester carbon here and there. You know, and a lot of soil scientists disagree on how to measure it and what exactly is happening under different kinds of soils and circumstances and so on. But that doesn't seem to have stopped the private sector. I see that Indigo Agriculture has signed up farmers and is paying $20 a ton for the CO2 equivalent for greenhouse gas reductions and carbon sequestration, which they are somehow measuring with a protocol that was developed by the Climate Action Reserve. You know, are we just going to have this kind of wild west of private firms going out and signing people up and paying them? And would $20 a ton do anything for farmers in California?
I can start on that. I think it's important to go back a little bit on carbon markets and say that, you know, the first carbon markets were attempted with the Chicago Climate Exchange, and back in the early 2000s, primarily in the upper Midwest. Farmers unions and farmer bureau chapters in Wisconsin and Minnesota and Iowa began signing up farmers to do great practices, prairie plantings, rotational grazing, grass-based practices to provide offset credits as part of the Chicago Climate Exchange. So it was a voluntary market, so universities and companies could sign up with the Chicago Exchange. They could buy these offset credits from farmers to offset their own greenhouse gas emissions. And at its peak, that market offered $7 per metric ton of CO2 equivalent, which we can talk a little bit more about what that means in a moment. But But in the end, with the Chicago exchange, there turned out to be more credits, more farmers who were willing to sign up for the exchange than there were buyers. And the market collapsed down to 5 cents per metric ton of CO2e, and eventually collapsed entirely, leaving those farmers who had committed to those practices and paid additional costs to do them out in the cold. And then if you fast forward to the California compliance market, we have a regulatory carbon market here, as Californians may be familiar with. But we've only managed to develop 2 agriculture-related offset protocols, as you're very familiar with, Dave. One is to pay for dairy digesters to capture methane on large CAFOs. And the other was also to reduce methane emissions, but in the rice sector. We haven't had a single rice farmer sign up for that protocol because the transaction costs to participate in the market are quite high, and the amount of money that you would actually receive from the market quite low. So it doesn't make a lot of economic sense. And for dairy digesters, because we have many multiple streams of state and federal dollars that go, millions and millions of dollars that go towards paying for those digesters, we have quite a few digester credits in the California market. But mainly for most farmers in California, the carbon market has been inaccessible because protocols haven't been developed, the transaction costs are high, they don't allow small and mid-scale farmers to come together under multiple projects, et cetera. And then finally, if we turn to Indigo Ag, which I think they say $20 per ton, but they're actually offering, I think there are some numbers they have to take off of that. Farmers get 15 bucks per metric ton. And we looked at, if you compared a California Healthy Soils grant, we looked at one farm that was over the 3 years of that Healthy Soils grant, they were going to move towards sequestering 110 metric tons of CO2e. If they had taken instead an Indigo Ag contract under the Healthy Soils contract, they got about $64,000 over 3 years. That dollar figure is based on what is the cost of implementing those practices, and those costs are based on USDA NRCS practice standard costs. So $64,000 under CDFA's Healthy Soils program, you get about $1,600 from Indigo Ag if you participated in their $15 per metric ton of CO2e. So quite a stark contrast when thinking about the CDFA program is looking at what's the cost of buying compost or what's the cost of buying cover crop seed, et cetera. None of those considerations are part of that Indigo Ag number. So farmers are actually losing out on that carbon market proposition from Indigo Ag. And I would argue that not only farmers are losing out, but the environment is also losing out.
So Eric, do you have anything you want to add to that on these carbon markets?
Yeah, I think Jeanne raised 2 really interesting points, and one right at the end that I'll start with, and that is that if you only measure and only pay for carbon, that's the only thing you'll get. And if we get so preoccupied with the notion of a carbon market or a carbon bank, we run a real risk of failing to pay for other types of benefits that we know conservation agricultural practices create. We lose water quality and water quantity, we lose air quality, we lose wildlife habitat, we lose we sacrifice everything on the altar of soil carbon, which is incredibly important, but it is not the only benefit. And so we need to be mindful when we're looking at the next phase of conservation funding in this country to incentivize all the things that we want to see come out of these conservation practices. The other thing, Dave, you had mentioned, is this a Wild West? And I really like that metaphor, because that's also the height of a snake oil salesman. And I think that's a pretty apt metaphor for what we're seeing right now. We know there is a lot of money on the sidelines from financial institutions. We've got a couple of them that have already made some pretty significant investments in agricultural carbon, if not credits, then payments to farmers. And we know there's a lot more money. And as long as there's money to be made, there will be organizations that are willing to step in and, verify or authenticate the degree to which a particular practice sequesters carbon or has some other kind of environmental benefit, and they're going to help those people spend their money as they take a little bit off the top. And so I think that's something that we're seeing right now play out in real time.
Yeah, I think that is a potential danger. I mean, you get these sort of venture capital funded enterprises of all sorts, and then they just up and disappear. It's a lot of them. I was on the call about the water efficiency program a couple of days ago, and a number of irrigation specialists were complaining about just that kind of thing. You know, it's like companies that produce some equipment and so on and so forth, and they're supposed to maintain it, right, over a 10-year period or something, but the company goes out of business and then, you know, leaves the farmer holding the bag. So I'm really wondering about some of these carbon market things. So Jeanne, I know that CalCAN organized a sort of nationwide, I mean, I don't know how many states are involved, but you know, different state programs or efforts in different states on climate change. Can you tell us more about that and what has been learned from that experience?
Sure, absolutely. We were part of starting a National Healthy Soils Policy Network, and it's just that. It's farmer-led organizations interested in advancing solutions to climate change with a particular focus on soil management strategies, looking at different state policy models. So it's an information sharing network. And I will put in the chat here a couple related links. In terms of the groups involved, there are, I think, 24 organizations. That keeps growing, the number of organizations involved with the National Healthy Soils Policy Network, and I think covering 25 states. And we're currently, I think, at 9 states, including California, that have passed healthy soils type legislation to advance state efforts to support farmers in adopting soil health practices that help increase carbon sinks. So I'll just add a few things to the chat about that.
Great. So Eric, you mentioned this Agricultural Resilience Act. Is this the kind of thing that the public should, you know, be thinking of engaging in? Are there other things that the public could engage in? Well, you know, who want to do something about this? What would you suggest for them?
Yeah, well, I thank you, Dave. You absolutely can and should reach out to your member of Congress, and that's both in the House and the Senate side, and tell them what kind of bills you want to see in this session of Congress. And this is a really important session of Congress, the 117th, because in this Congress, this 2-year period, you're going to see the introduction of a number of marker bills that will then wind up getting rolled up into the 2023 Farm Bill that'll be drafted in the next Congress. And so it's really important to get good bills out there. Obviously, you know, I dropped a link in the chat. The Agricultural Resilience Act is an important bill and does a lot of what you know, Jeanne and I have been talking about today. It makes really significant investments in research and soil health programs. It protects existing farmland. It incentivizes high quality conservation practices. It supports pasture-based livestock systems, including silvopastures. And there was saw a note in the comment about silvopasture. It also has components for reducing food waste and increasing on-farm energy production. And as we are working to reintroduce that bill in this Congress, it may also feature a few additional provisions, perhaps a little bit more language on organic production systems, and perhaps a little bit more on perennialization as a way of making carbon and sequestration and soil health a little bit more durable, because we tend to speak about this in the terms of, you know, annual row crop plantings, and perennialization is an important element of making more durable carbon sinks. So you can certainly do that. And I think calling your members of Congress to advocate for those bills is a great thing to do. You could consider joining an organization that's a member of the NSAC coalition, or to bring your voice to DC through either NSAC or another farmer serving organization that may have the opportunity to host a fly-in or to circulate a letter that is in support of giving farmers the tools that they need to mitigate climate change.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, we have over a dozen organizations in California that are members of NSAC, California Certified Organic Farmers, CAFF, FarmLink, I'm not, Center for Food Safety. I'm not going to remember them all. And so if you have anything to do with any organization as a member of NSAC, it'd be good to encourage that organization to, participate in the climate change activities at NSAC. We don't always get that much policy participation from the organizations. And so anything we can do in California to encourage more, I think would probably be helpful to NSAC. So let's see.
Dave, you want to talk a little bit about, I don't mean to jump in, but do you want to talk a little bit about reconciliation? Because we've got some pretty big things happening there.
I skipped that. You're right. So yeah, why don't you explain what reconciliation is, since it's being used in this $1.9 trillion COVID package, and then how might it be used vis-a-vis climate change efforts? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So thank you for letting me dive in. And I did want to mention this because there are some significant short-term impacts, but really big longer-term impacts to the use of reconciliation. So just for those of you who are not big parliamentary procedure nerds, reconciliation is an unusual and infrequently used parliamentary process. It is a Senate-only process. The important part happens in the Senate. It happens both in the House and Senate. And the key element is you can use reconciliation to affect either spending, income, or budget caps. And the important thing to know about the reconciliation process is, as the House and Senate work together to craft a spending or income bill or budget cap bill, it only takes 51 votes in the Senate to pass the piece of legislation through reconciliation. There are rules that limit the kinds of things that you can put into a reconciliation package. They have to, again, be focused around spending or income or budget caps. So you can't just go into a bunch of authorizing, but you can do a lot of spending. And as David said, the $1.9 trillion package, the COVID relief package that just passed the House on Friday, is the House's version of the reconciliation package that will now be considered in the Senate. It's expected to pass. It contains some pretty significant investments in agriculture. There's about $4 billion in there to support farmers through direct payments, for PPE for farmers and farm workers. A lot of money for food system support. There's $100 million to help with overtime for small slaughter facilities. There is a lot of money for additional nutrition programs, so extending SNAP benefits and school meals because of the impacts of the pandemic. So there's a lot of money in that package for agriculture, and that money should be coming down the pike pretty soon. We think the Senate's going to take it up in the middle of next week, and it'll take them a little bit of time to consider it all. There'll have to be a vote-a-rama, which is into the early hours of the morning voting process, where all members are allowed to try to amend the bill as they would like. But we expect that $1.9 trillion to be coming to the American people soon. That's the near term. The longer term is we expect another reconciliation package a little later this year, sometime late spring, early summer. And that reconciliation package doesn't have a name yet, but it's starting to shape up. And it's going to probably have 3 different tranches of money in it. The first is going to be infrastructure. The second is going to be the caring economy. And the third is climate change. And some places those will sort of overlap, but those are the sort of 3 organizing sections that leadership in the House and Senate are going to be putting together. So obviously, infrastructure can have some pretty big impacts for some elements of the economy. Certainly going to be major for transportation and energy generation. The climate change section is going to be really significant, we believe, for agriculture, and we're working really hard to make sure that farmers are considered central to the administration's response to climate change, as they also work with energy generation and transportation and other sectors of the economy. And finally, the caring economy is also very important, but perhaps outside the context of the conversation that we're having here today. We don't know how big that package is going to be, but it is going to be very large. And even though infrastructure tends to be one of the more bipartisan issues in Congress, everybody likes to spend money on roads, dams, bridges, and locks, and those sorts of things. It is very likely that infrastructure will stay part of this reconciliation package and that it will move. And when it does, if it does move, it'll probably be again with that 51 vote threshold.
I see.
And I just want to emphasize that's a lot of information and a lot of really good information. And yes, very wonky, but the bottom line is that that's how, because the Senate is is evenly split, that budget reconciliation is ultimately how climate policy is going to happen. And it's just a critical effort this year. And to get back to Dave, to your earlier point of how people might engage in these issues, whether you're, a part of CAFF or a member of CCOF or just interested, there are plenty of organizations in which you can connect with in California on these issues. And whether it's asking your congressperson to co-sponsor the Ag Resilience Act, which will be really key this year, or engaging with Senator Feinstein on what needs to happen in terms of ag appropriations. She's an important member in this discussion. There are lots of opportunities to engage, from writing letters to making phone calls to participating with CAFF and others.
Yeah, that's great. We're trying to get Jenny Lester Moffett appointed undersecretary at the USDA, and so if that happens, we have a direct line there into these kinds of things. Well, before I turn to some of the questions, well, actually, there was a question in here about agricultural burning, and it just brought to mind, this whole question of adaptation to climate change. Here in California, we've had these terrible forest fires. It just gets hotter and windier every year. Right now, the wind has been blowing for days for no good reason that I can see. And I just feel like this is going to be our future. We're going to have hot, windy summers and more forest fires. We have it's 2/3 of the legislature is Democratic. We have a Democratic governor. Jeanne, what do you think prevents us from doing more along these lines? I mean, last year we had all kinds of bills on forest fires and fire resilience and so forth, and they all collapsed. What is it that prevents us from actually solving these kinds of issues here?
That's a great question, and we have some good people who are also on the line here who could weigh in on that. There isn't necessarily unanimity in the Democratic members of the legislature. We have very progressive to more conservative members, so that's part of the dynamic. I was glad to see Governor Newsom propose $1 billion in investments on wildfire prevention efforts in his budget for this year. We have a surplus of funds now. It's better than where we thought we might be this time last year. So there are certainly opportunities for California to really step up on a diversity of issues as it relates to climate change, wildfires being among them, climate smart agriculture, and more. I think that one of the challenges that we face in California has been sporadic funding for this work. We have relied, as we talked about earlier, on the cap and trade dollars, the results from the auctions for the cap and trade program to help fund many of our climate investments. And then those dollars have gone up and down over the years. They've been used for non-climate investments. And so we're interested in alternatives to using those cap and trade funds and looking to create a more stable funding source. I noticed there was a question in the chat about California bond. And so I wanted to just briefly address that. CalCAN is part of a 17-member coalition of food and agriculture organizations that's co-sponsoring with Assembly Member Robert Rivas, AB 125, which is a food and agriculture focused bond measure that would invest dollars holistically in economic recovery and climate resilience in the food and ag system. I'm happy to talk more about that if people have questions, but we're excited about that effort because it brings together both the food side. We've seen tremendous increases in hunger in California since the beginning of the pandemic. We've seen great disruptions in food markets. There's a real need to reinvest in our food infrastructure, emergency food delivery, to commercial kitchens, to kitchens for schools, for school meals. And then we've seen, of course, tremendous impacts on farm workers from the pandemic and a real need to address overcrowded housing. And then on the ag side, a real need to invest in the programs we've talked so much about, healthy soils to technical assistance, et cetera. So the bond is intended to look at the food and ag system in a holistic way, and how can we combat hunger and create greater resilience in our food and farming system. So when greater weather extremes come, as they have been, we're better prepared and better able to meet the needs of Californians so people do not have to go hungry.
Yeah, I think in this $1.9 trillion package, as Eric was saying, there's considerable amount of money that hopefully will be available to help small farmers this time around. You know, we've struggled over the past year to make these government programs work for small farms, particularly for specialty crop growers, organic farmers here. And so hopefully this time around we can do this. We have new people in charge of FSA and, you know, some of the other agencies that are charged with doing this. And so at CAFF, we're going to make a concerted effort to see if we can't help more of the farmers who've been struggling. Do we see some other questions here in the chat that we should address?
Dave, can I hop on it?
Yeah.
Oh no, go ahead, Jeannie. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think we've addressed a number of them, but if people have more questions, they can always add them to the chat.
And Dave, you know, you were talking about assistance going directly to farmers, and you know, it's you know, primarily we're talking about climate change, but you know, the pandemic is another extraordinary set of difficulties facing everyone, but you know, farmers and agriculture writ large. And NSAC and NSAC members have been working really hard to improve the quality of the coronavirus food assistance program. That's the direct payments to farmers, as well as the farm to families food box program. And that program has gotten better because of the advocacy of NSAC coalition members and lots of other groups as well. Primarily improving from CFAP 1 to CFAP 2 with the addition of a payment program based on revenue available to specialty crop farmers. And before and after this call, I'm continuing to work on a series of recommendations that our members have put together for the new administration to make the CFAP 3 program work even better. So to extend that revenue-based model to some additional types of producers and really make sure that farmers who've been affected by the pandemic can stay in business long enough to get to a point where they can, you know, well, just make it to the other end of the pandemic, and then they can begin to worry a little bit more about climate change investments as well. But we need to keep them going in the near term.
Yeah, there are obviously many other forces affecting small farmers. And it's been a very difficult time for people. I think we all recognize that. Yeah, I mean, the climate change, we're impacted. We're trying to do this bond, and perhaps the bond will have some adaptation money in it. Is there a discussion in Washington, D.C. about adaptation type things as opposed to mitigation of climate change?
There are, but it doesn't happen in the agricultural context as much as it probably should. The adaptation is often discussed in hardening durable infrastructure, raising cities, seawalls, storm water runoff, those types of hard, physical asset investments to help prevent the near-term impacts of climate change. But we don't often see those same kinds of conversations happening in agriculture, those same tools extended to farmers. There is greater work in research and extension in particular to help farmers adapt in the near term, change plantings, change types of rotations, get in animals with genetics that are a little more suitable to the changing climate in which farmers find themselves. But really, much of what we're talking about is about the mitigation efforts and increased conservation practices. That isn't to say that increased conservation practices in and of themselves don't have an adaptation component. Certainly, if you're increasing soil health, you're going to wind up with better drainage, which will certainly help you if you're in a part of a country that is having increased severe rain events. And certainly having better root structures and better soil health is going to help you weather extreme drought that we're finding more frequent and more intense in more parts of the country. But it is not talked about in quite the same way. We spend more of our time talking about, I think, mitigation than we do adaptation.
Jeanne, you want to say something about that?
Well, I actually wanted to pivot a little bit. I thought Eric gave a great response to that. There was a question in the chat about California Farm Bureau originally opposing AB 32, which was our Global Warming Solutions Act back in 2006. And the question is, has their attitude changed towards the climate crisis? And I would say that it has in California. We've certainly had the Farm Bureau sort of switch to an attitude of being more supportive of having resources available to farmers to address the climate crisis. We actually worked quite a bit with the Farm Bureau on a number of bills to make it easier for farmers to get their on-farm renewable energy projects connected to the grid. Dave, you mentioned that at the top of this discussion. And more recently, I think they've been more supportive of late of programs like the Healthy Soils program. It's still an ongoing conversation, and there are areas of disagreement, but I think we are certainly in a different place than we were back in 2006.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think some of these programs like Healthy Soils and SWEEP and so forth have become sort of institutionalized, and so people, there's much greater demand for them than there is money. I mean, that's our biggest problem now, is trying to generate enough money to actually help farmers adopt these things. Whereas, when we started, there was just a lot of skepticism about the whole enterprise. So I think we've made definite progress in that respect. All right, we have 2 minutes. I'll give each of you a minute to say some wrap-up kind of idea that pops into your brain. Eric, why don't you start?
Well, like I said, one of my favorite things to do is to be on a panel with the two of you, because I always learn things. And for those of you who are joining the call from California today, I used to work for a New York senator, and I will tell you, as goes California and as goes New York, so goes the nation. And so the work that you're doing both individually and collectively in the state of California is vital. We at the federal level will borrow from our coalition members in California. We will straight up steal your good ideas and we will hammer them into federal policy. And even as a former New York staffer, I have a long tradition of borrowing from the people and the growers and producers of California. So thank you for all the work that you've done, and really looking forward to this next phase where we can make a real difference in climate change for American farmers.
Thank you, Eric. Jeanne?
We welcome your borrowing, Eric. I'll just say that please, if you're inclined to learning a little bit more about legislation, check out Assembly Bill 125. It's about economic recovery and climate resilience in food and ag, and the full bill will be introduced in mid-March. So that's an exciting opportunity to get engaged with the future of funding for these issues. And then I would say, if you're not already a member of CAFF, it's a great time to become a member of CAFF and get engaged both at the state and federal level on these issues. We really need to be engaged at both the state and the federal level when it comes to climate change and agriculture issues, and CAFF is a great place to do that.
Yeah, thanks, Jeanne. So thank you to Jeanne Merrill and Eric Deeble for their participation on a Saturday afternoon here. And again, this workshop, there'll be an evaluation that will be linked and sent in a follow-up email. It's been recorded. It'll be on YouTube. If you think some friends of yours should watch it, let them know. And there's a virtual expo hall, which was linked in the chat at one point. You could go there. And again, if you feel so moved, make a small donation to the Small Farm Conference. And hopefully next year we'll see one another in person. So thank you very much for your attention, and that will do it for us today.